The air is thick with sea spray, splintering wood, and the screams of men. Below your feet, the deck lurches not with the rhythm of the waves, but with the violent shudder of impact. You're not a sailor, trained from boyhood to read the wind and water. You're a legionary, a soldier of the land, now packed shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of others on a floating plank of wood. Your only job is to wait for the sickening crunch, the thunderous crash of a giant spiked bridge dropping onto an enemy ship, and then to charge across. Your job is to turn their deck into just another bloody Roman battlefield. Forget elegant naval maneuvers and ramming speeds. For a Roman marine, surviving a battle at sea was a special kind of hell. This wasn't the graceful dance of Athenian triremes. This was a brutal, ugly, floating brawl. It was the Roman way of war, adapted for the sea. And to understand how Rome came to rule the Mediterranean, you have to understand why they chose to turn naval combat into the one thing they knew best: a grinding, terrifying infantry fight to the death. Before Rome became the master of the sea, it was a land power, through and through. Its strength was in its legions, the discipline of its infantry, and the relentless march of its armies. The sea was an alien environment, a treacherous domain that belonged to older, more experienced maritime powers. Peoples like the Greeks, and most importantly, the Carthaginians, had spent centuries perfecting naval warfare. Their sailors were pros. Their commanders understood the complex dance of fleets, and their ships were built for one deadly purpose. So, for an early Roman soldier sent to sea, life was miserable and dangerous. Even before a battle started. Imagine being a Miles Classiarius, a Marine in the brand new Roman Navy. The term itself is almost a contradiction. You're a soldier, trained to fight on solid ground, to form a shield wall, to brace for a cavalry charge. Now, you're stuck on a quinquereme, a ship that, yeah, it was bigger and more stable than older models, but it was still a cramped, chaotic, and let's be honest, a pretty disgusting place to live. The ship is like a miniature city with none of the benefits. You're packed in with over 300 rowers and up to 120 fellow Marines. The rowers, despite what you see in movies, weren't usually slaves chained to their oars. They were often free, lower-class citizens, who were expected to grab a sword and fight when needed. But their main job created the soundtrack of your life. The endless clatter of oars, the shouts of the timekeeper, and the stench of sweat and unwashed bodies in the cramped lower decks. You can just imagine the air down there, a thick, suffocating mix of bilge water, stale food, and human waste. There were no private quarters. You'd sleep on the hard deck, exposed to the elements, using your gear as a pillow. Food was basic: hardtack biscuits, porridge, olives, and sour wine. Fresh water was strictly rationed and would quickly turn stagnant. And then there was the sea itself. Most Roman recruits were farmers from the Italian heartland. Many had probably never seen a body of water bigger than the Tiber River. Seasickness would have been constant and debilitating. Warships, built for speed over comfort, ride low in the water. In anything but the calmest seas, waves would crash over the deck, soaking everyone and everything. Storms were a terrifyingly common way to die. Early Roman ships were often heavier and clumsier than their Carthaginian rivals, and adding new gadgets made them even more top-heavy and unstable, a fatal flaw in a sudden Mediterranean gale. In 255 BCE, a Roman fleet returning from Africa was hit by a storm that destroyed a staggering 384 ships, and according to some sources, killed up to 100,000 men. For a soldier on board, there was nowhere to run. You were just trapped on a fragile wooden shell, totally at the mercy of the waves. This was the core problem for Rome. In the 3rd century BCE, their ambitions led them right into a conflict with the greatest naval power in the Western Mediterranean, Carthage. The First Punic War, which kicked off in 264 BCE, was all about controlling Sicily, and you couldn't control Sicily without controlling the sea. The Carthaginians were masters of naval warfare. They had all these slick moves, like the diecplus, a lightning-fast breakthrough to ram an enemy from the side, and the periplus, an outflanking maneuver to circle a slower fleet. Their ships were designed for it, light, fast, and agile. When the Romans first tried to fight them, the results were a disaster. Their ships were clumsy copies, and their crews were green. They couldn't hope to outsail the Carthaginians. They couldn't win a battle of seamanship. For a Roman general watching his fleet get picked apart, the problem was obvious. How do you beat an enemy at sea when you're not a nation of sailors? How do you fight a naval war when your greatest strength is your infantry? The answer, when it came, would be brutally simple and totally Roman. If you can't win their game, you make them play yours. To really get the genius of what Rome did, you first have to understand the old rules of naval combat, which were basically written by the Greeks. For centuries, the peak of naval tech was the trireme. It was essentially a guided missile made of wood. About 120 feet long, these ships were light, slender, and powered by 170 oarsmen on 3 levels. The goal in a classic Greek naval battle was to use speed and agility to ram your opponent with a heavy bronze ram on the bow. Boarding was an afterthought. These ships only carried a handful of Marines. The ship was the weapon. Victory went to the fleet with the best rowers and the boldest commanders. This was the tradition Rome faced, perfected by the Carthaginians with their bigger, more powerful quinqueremes. According to the historian Polybius, Rome's whole naval project started with a huge stroke of luck. A Carthaginian quinquereme ran aground and was captured. The Romans supposedly used this ship as a blueprint to build their own fleet. As total novices, their first copies were heavier and slower than the originals, a huge disadvantage. But the Romans weren't just trying to copy their enemy. They were looking for a way to use their own strengths. So, how did they solve their naval problem? They didn't try to become better sailors overnight. Instead, they invented a device that made sailing skill almost irrelevant. They invented the corvus. The corvus, or raven in Latin, was a stroke of brutalist genius. It was a boarding bridge, about 36 feet long, mounted on a pole at the front of a Roman ship. It could be raised and swiveled around. At the end of this gangplank was a heavy, pointed spike shaped like a bird's beak, hence the name. In battle, a Roman ship wouldn't try to elegantly outmaneuver anyone. It would just get close. As it neared an enemy vessel, the crew would cut the ropes, and the corvus would slam down onto the enemy deck. The spike would bite deep into the planks, locking the 2 ships together. The enemy was trapped. In that one moment, it was no longer a naval battle. It was a land battle on a floating platform. Roman Marines, shielded and disciplined, would pour across the bridge. They weren't fighting sailors. They were fighting trained, heavily armed legionaries. The Carthaginian crews, more used to rowing than hand-to-hand combat, were often slaughtered by the sheer ferocity of the Roman assault. The corvus single-handedly canceled out Carthage's centuries of naval experience. It was a terrifyingly effective solution. Its first major test came at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE. The Carthaginian commander, totally confident in his fleet's superiority, attacked the Romans head-on. The result was a complete shock. The Romans dropped the corvus, boarded the Carthaginian ships, and systematically crushed their crews. It was a stunning victory that proved their wild new idea actually worked. This new tactic also changed how they built their ships. While the Greeks had prioritized speed, the Romans started to favor size and stability. They fully embraced the quinquereme, not as a ramming vessel, but as a floating fortress. A Roman quinquereme was a heavy, robust ship. Built to last from tough woods like pine and oak, it had a full deck, providing a large, stable platform to carry a huge contingent of up to 120 Marines, as well as heavy artillery like catapults and ballistae. These ships became floating siege towers that could rain down hell on an enemy before the inevitable boarding action. It was slower, sure, but it was a beast. This marked a fundamental shift in ancient naval warfare, from battles decided by seamanship to bloody brawls that emphasized the power of heavy infantry. The development of the corvus and the quinquereme as a troop transport shows Rome's incredible ability to adapt. This philosophy of turning weaknesses into strengths is a theme you see again and again in Roman history. If you're enjoying this look at Roman military innovation, take a moment to subscribe and hit the like button. It helps us create more content like this. And if you're interested in another story of Roman adaptation, check out our video on how they conquered the rugged terrain of Britannia. Now, back to the Punic Wars, where Rome was about to put its new naval doctrine to the ultimate test in one of the largest sea battles in human history. With the corvus in their arsenal, the Romans were no longer the underdogs at sea. They were a terrifying new force, ready to challenge Carthage for total control of the Mediterranean. This all came to a head in 256 BCE at the Battle of Cape Ignomus, off the coast of Sicily. This wasn't just a naval battle. It was the prelude to a full-scale Roman invasion of Africa. The stakes couldn't have been higher. By sheer scale, Ignomus dwarfs almost any other naval battle in history. The Romans fielded a fleet of around 330 warships. The Carthaginian fleet was even larger, with about 350 ships. All told, nearly 700 warships were about to collide, carrying a combined total of well over 250,000 men, rowers, sailors, and marines. If you were a Roman marine on board, the sight must have been both incredible and terrifying. A forest of masts stretching to the horizon, the sun glinting off thousands of bronze helmets. The Romans adopted a clever wedge formation. The Carthaginians, meanwhile, planned to use their superior numbers and speed to envelop the Romans. As the battle began, the Carthaginian center deliberately pulled back, luring the Roman lead squadrons forward. This was the trap. The Carthaginian wings then swept in, attacking the Roman squadron, protecting the transports, and another force swung around to attack the rear guard. The battle devolved into 3 separate, chaotic fights. If you were a Marine on a ship in that 3rd squadron, this was the moment hell was unleashed. You'd have to cut the tow lines to the transport ships, leaving them vulnerable as you turned to face a wave of enemy vessels. But the Romans held on. Pushed back towards the coast, they used the corvus as a defensive threat. Carthaginian captains, terrified of being grappled and boarded, were afraid to get too close, which made their ramming attacks less effective. Meanwhile, the Roman vanguard, having crushed the weak Carthaginian center, made a brilliant move. The consuls rallied their ships and turned back to rescue the rest of the fleet. First, they smashed the force attacking the 3rd squadron, and then they turned to help the surrounded rear guard. The Carthaginian fleet, now caught between multiple Roman forces, was systematically destroyed. The corvus was again decisive. Ship after ship was locked in a death grip, and the superior Roman infantry swarmed across. Imagine the scene on a captured deck: a slippery mess of blood, seawater, and splintered wood. You're fighting in heavy armor on a moving platform, struggling for footing as men fall overboard, weighed down by their gear with no hope of rescue. The sounds are a nightmare of clashing swords, shattering shields, and the screams of the dying. At Ignomus, the Romans lost only 24 ships, while they sank 30 Carthaginian vessels and captured 64. For Carthage, the human cost was catastrophic, with estimates of up to 40,000 men killed or captured. But for all its success, the corvus had a fatal flaw. Its immense weight, perched high on the bow, made Roman ships dangerously unstable in rough weather. The devastating fleet losses to storms in 255 and 249 BCE were largely blamed on this instability, and the corvus was eventually abandoned. As Roman sailors gained more experience, they got better at traditional naval tactics. But the core idea never left. Roman warships would always carry a large contingent of marines, ensuring that if it came down to a hand-to-hand fight, Rome would win. Later, they developed other grappling devices, like the harpax, a catapult-fired grappling hook to get the same result without the dangerous instability. The brutal logic of turning sea battles into land battles never really went away. This whole story is just so Roman. Faced with a challenge where they were completely outmatched, they didn't give up. They adapted. They innovated. They didn't learn to play the game better than their enemies. They changed the rules of the game to suit themselves. The corvus was a masterstroke of pragmatic brutality. It allowed a nation of soldiers to conquer the sea, paving the way for the destruction of Carthage and the beginning of a naval dominance that would last for centuries. This dominance turned the Mediterranean into what the Romans would proudly call Mare Nostrum, our sea. Control of the sea was the glue that held the vast Roman Empire together. It let legions move quickly, protected vital grain shipments from Egypt, and allowed trade to flourish. The memory of the massive, bloody fleet battles of the Punic Wars faded as the Roman Navy became more of a policing force, using lighter, faster ships to hunt down pirates and keep the peace. But the foundation of that peace was built on the hellish experiences of those first Roman Marines. It was built on the splintered decks of Carthaginian ships, in the terrifying chaos of a boarding action, and by the grim determination of soldiers forced to master a new, terrifying kind of warfare. The Roman genius wasn't always in pure invention, but in ruthless, brilliant adaptation. They looked at the sea and didn't see a world of graceful maneuvers, but just another battlefield to be conquered by the discipline and cold steel of their legions. It leaves you with a question. Who is the greater military innovator? The one who perfects the existing rules, or the one with the audacity to throw the rulebook out entirely? Thank you for watching. If you want to learn more about the ancient world's greatest conflicts, please consider subscribing. Let us know in the comments what part of Roman military history you'd like us to explore next. Until next time.